Our next speaker, our next author rather, was born in New Jersey and now lives in DeKalb. She earned her BA at Uppsala College, and her avocational interests are hiking, reading, cooking, and gardening. She holds a membership in the International Reading Association and the Society of Children, Book Writers, and Illustrators. Her book is an excellent book in many ways, and her niche that she's going to speak about is related to child labor, which, sometimes, when you hold that postcard up and people want to comment on something interesting, they'll say, come on, child labor has to be the most important thing. So I'm talking about Sally Walker.
Hi. So can you tell that I make myself right at home and I'll rearrange the furniture and everything? If I were Oprah, I would be telling you, one of you under your chair has a special certificate for a car. But I'm not Oprah. So anyway, I'm a children's book writer. I've written about 60 plus books for kids, and Underground Fire is intended for junior high age kids and up, and adults who don't want to be overwhelmed by TMI, if you know what I mean. So when Jack called me and asked if I would be willing to come down here to speak, I was really pleased for that, for the opportunity to be able to do that. So thank you all from the Bureau of Historical Society, by the way, for encouraging me to come. And that grant, I've got to tell you, that library museum needs it so much. That is just phenomenal. But at any rate, I had no connections to Cherry Mine at all when I started my research. I do have coal connections, though. My great-grandfather was a hoisting engineer at the Fairmount Shaft in Pittston, Pennsylvania. And my grandfather remembered when he was a little boy, his father took him down into the mine and said to him, I don't ever want you to work in a coal mine. And my great-grandfather was a badge of honor in the family that he was a hoisting engineer and didn't have to work down where it was so very, very dangerous. So anyway, when we're talking about the mines, when I knew I wanted to tell this story, I wanted to approach it a little bit differently in the sense that there were kids working in mines, and that was something that always astonished me. I also wanted to try to bring in the perspective of women as well, because the women of Cherry were very affected by what happened. So as much as I could with my book, I tried to incorporate testimony given in the coroner's report, the 700-page document that Karen Tintori was writing about. I read that document also, and by the way, it is available online through the University of Illinois, so if you want to read it, it's digitally there. If you look under the Caldwell Collection, is how you can find it. But I first found, actually, Cherry Mine by reading Karen Tintori's book, Trapped, and if you haven't read it, you must. It is an edge of your seat reading. In 2009, I had a couple of friends that said, hey, we're going down to Cherry, Illinois, for the anniversary of the Cherry Mine disaster. I didn't know what that even was, but I said, sure, it's a nice day, I'll come. While I was here, after leaving the museum next door, I got on a little trolley, sat next to a woman, and she said, can I show you something? And I said, sure. She took a pocket watch out of her purse, and she said, would you like to hold this? Which I said, of course. And she said, this watch belonged to my grandfather. They used it to identify his body when he came up from the mine. And she said, this is the first time he's been back to Cherry since we buried him. And at that point, the hairs on my arms were like standing up. And for me, that's a sign that there's a story here. Now, I'm supposed to be talking about children's labor, so let's get on task here. I want to set the stage for you a little bit regarding children's labor. According to the 1900 U.S. Census, 1 in every 6 children under the age of 16 was working for wages. Now that doesn't have to be a coal mine, that could be selling newspapers on the streets, working in mills, working in other kinds of factories. Between the years 1890 and 1903, three major laws to limit the kind of work that children could do and the number of hours that they could be employed were enacted. And that would include things like mills, factories, sweatshops, and mines, of course. May 15, 1903, Illinois passed the most comprehensive child labor law in the state's history. Child labor in coal mines was addressed in that act, and mine owners and managers were instructed, quote, "No more children under the age of 16 should be permitted or suffered to be employed." About 2,200 children were discharged from employment in Illinois coal mines as a result of that act.
What year was that again?
1903. Okay. So May 23rd, 1903, the Pantagraph newspaper, published in Bloomington, quoted Edgar T. Davies, the chief factory inspector of Illinois. And he said that school records should have to provide evidence of a child's age, not simply a parental statement, as far as regarding the age of their children and employment. And in some cities and counties, baptismal records were used in place of school certificates. County birth certificates could be used as well. Not all counties were standardized as far as registering births at that time. There was an organization called the National Child Labor Committee that was founded in 1904. It was a nonprofit organization that gave basically a voice to the child labor movement. And its mission was to, quote, present the rights, awareness, dignity, well-being, and education of children and youth as they relate to work and working, end quote. So states were starting to fall in line a bit regarding child employment, particularly with respect to the mines. In Pennsylvania, they enacted a law in 1905 where boys who were employed as coal breakers, those would have been the young men that were up at the top of the tipple, and they were breaking the coal as the coal and the detritus that was around the coal was removed from the mine. They had to be 14 years of age. At that time, they had kids as young as 7 and 8 doing the job. And those that work in the mines had to be 16 years of age or older. The estimate at the time in Pennsylvania was that fully 60% of the young men affected by the law would then be barred from working there because they were younger than 16. At the same time, the labor laws that they were enacting also had kind of provisions built into the laws that the children also had to prove that they had gotten a degree of proficiency in English and arithmetic as well, so they couldn't be just skipping school. In Illinois, in December of 1906, the Moline Dispatch had an article about it, and they said that the Illinois child labor had been reduced by 80% since that law that I just told you about that occurred in 1903. Edgar T. Davies, the factory inspector, stated, quote, "Child labor has been driven from the coal mines of Illinois. This was accomplished by my interpretation of the clause governing hazardous employment, an interpretation of the clause of the law that was combated by the Coal Miner Operators Association. A test case was subsequently brought in the courts in which I was sustained, and as a result, 2,200 children were emancipated from a life of underground servitude. Consequently," he went on to say, "no child under the age of 16 can work in a coal mine in Illinois." Otto moved the family here because he knew the new modern mine was a great opportunity for the family. However, Otto died just about a year after they moved to Cherry, and that left his wife Mary with no source of income. Over the course of her marriage, at that point, she had 8 children. Only 3 of them were still alive in 1908. Her elder son, Richard, was 15 at the time, and he became the family's sole wage earner. In 1909, his 14-year-old brother Albert joined him working in Cherry Mine. They were clearly violating child labor laws. I also talk about the Howard family. Now, Ron, you mentioned the Howards. Sam Howard, Selena Howard and her husband Charles, they were both born in Belgium or in France. And by 1908, they had 6 living children. However, family life must have been difficult because by the time the 1910 census came out, Selena was divorced from Charles. So they were separated at the time of the disaster. But at some point prior to the disaster, some months prior, a year or so, Samuel started working in the mine, and he would have been about 18 maybe at the time, I would guess. He was 19 or 20 when he died in the mine. Within another year and a half, his younger brother Alfred started working in the mine as well. He was only 14. Both Selena Howard and Mary Buckle had the school in town write certificates swearing that their 2 children, Albert Buckle and Alfred Howard, were 16 years of age. They were both 14 years old at the time. Those certificates were given to John Bundy, who was the manager of the mine, and he was called upon to present those if he needed to. Why did they put their kids in the mine? Because they had no other source of income. Selena Howard had 4 other kids at home. She didn't have a husband who at least was living with them at the time. He was living down in Spring Valley. So they had to do something. They had no choice, is what it boiled down to. So I wanted to bring their stories forward. Sam Howard, as Ron was reading sections before, while he and his brother Alfred were trapped in the mine, Sam kept a diary during that period of time, and he chronicles how things were for them during the time period that they were underground before they ultimately both died. Albert Buckle, on the other hand, he did make it out of the mine. He was down there with his brother Richard. Richard, his older brother, worked as a spragger. He took chunks of wood that you would stick in as chocks in the wheels of the pit cars so that they couldn't roll out of place while the miners were filling them. Albert worked as a trapper. He was one of the young boys who operated the doors, the ventilation doors in the tunnels of the mine. And in the coroner's report, developing the stories, Albert survived. And he was one of the people who was called on to testify in the inquiry, at the coroner's inquiry afterwards. And he describes very vividly what it was like in the mine as the fire had broken out. There was smoke filling the tunnels. They couldn't see. They asked to go up in the cage, and the cager wouldn't let them go up. They couldn't get the hoses over from the mule barn area to the area where the fire was occurring. At times it was too hot to touch hoses or metal fittings, but Albert did indeed make it up. And as I said, both of these guys were underage at the time. They should not have been working in the mine. 2 other families that I feature a lot. One is the Dona family, and Steve mentioned them earlier, Peter Dona. He was with his father, and they both did survive. Again, his testimony, and also a recording that he made, which is available in the Peru Library, tells about his experiences. And at the time, he was either 15 or 16. It just depends on whether you're looking at a census report or other reports. In any case, by that time, he had been also working in the mine underage by the time the disaster had occurred. And the other person that I kind of follow a little bit in the book is Matt Francisco. And Matt Francisco started working in the mine, again, when he was only about 15 years old. He'd been working as a trapper, and then he got a promotion. And the promotion occurred only just a couple of weeks, if that, before the disaster. And his job was to actually couple and uncouple the mine cars as they were brought from the roads from the miners had filled, and you were in the area of the cage that went down from the second level to the third level. And the miners would, or the mule drivers would bring their pit cars up to that area. That would uncouple or couple those cars and push them in and out of place to either go down to the lower level or to be circled around and brought up to the surface. He had that job for about, as I say, about 2 weeks, and he was the young man who actually parked the hay bale pit car underneath the dripping torch. And one of the things that, I mean, as Karen said in her segment, it was so many things that happened that shouldn't have happened, yet they did. And afterwards, to read so many testimonies and newspaper reports where so many grown men were really quick to point their finger at it was his fault, it was that boy's fault that it happened. You just want to say, hey, you hadn't done this job before. You were the adult that was there. You ignored the smoldering hay, but you're blaming it on the kid. So child labor, as Karen said, there are no records. It's very frustrating when you're doing nonfiction research, and all of the books that I write are nonfiction, to not have the answers to your questions. And one of the things that I've always wondered is, there were this many underage boys in the mine. How many underage boys, even younger than 14-year-olds, were working in the tipple, sorting the coal? And there are no records here that will substantiate that kind of stuff. So the disaster happened, and basically, again, bringing out stories. One of the things that had really captured my interest was knowing about the Visiting Nurses of Chicago Association. They sent 7 nurses down. By Monday morning, the nurses were up, out, and operating with the families in town. And as far as I know, this is the only book that has the picture of the nurses in it. And you have to have citations for this kind of stuff. It is public domain image, but I have written to any and all organizations in the state of Illinois that I could come up with, including the Visiting Nurses Association of Chicago, and nobody could give me a photo credit for this particular image, but I just decided it had to be in there anyway, because these women deserve to be represented. And I want to just read a little bit to you of what they experienced here in Charity. Early Monday morning, this would be the 15th, early Monday morning, Nurse Pearl Ringland, aided by one of the 6 nurses who had arrived with her the night before, began caring for injured men in the hospital that had been hastily set up in a railroad car. Ringland and Dr. Howe, who'd been one of the men who'd gone down 6 times to try to rescue folks, Dr. Ringland and Dr. Howe realized that miners' families desperately needed help. She tasked her remaining nurses with visiting every miner's home to treat ill women and children. Their reports concerned Ringland. Quote, during the day, the uneasiness seems to have increased among the families, and it has been difficult to keep them in their houses. Women with babies in arms walked through the rain to the mine shaft as early as 5 o'clock. Many of the children wearing worn-out shoes and summer clothing, she learned. Ringland entered several homes in response to her nurses' concerns. Quote, the mother with her 3 little ones was sitting in a cold room and no food. Another home I visited where the mother was ill and 5 children, the oldest 8 years of age, were crying because Pa did not come home. Never have I witnessed such utter grief and hopelessness, she said later. One of the people who was walking down Steel Street, that was the street where so many families lost a member of in the disaster, said that when they walked down Steel Street that night, all they could hear were people crying in their houses. So, looking again at labor after the disaster, people all of a sudden said, whoa, there were kids in that mine. On November 17, 1909, according to the Joliet News, Edgar Davies, the inspector, and 2 assistants were in Cherry investigating charges that underage boys were working in Cherry Mine and some had died in the disaster. The Joliet News reported, quote, officers of the mine company assert the charges are untrue and that they have certificates giving the ages of the boys employed and none are below 16. If any were younger, they gave false ages in filling out certificates, end quote. Dixon Evening Telegraph on Thursday, same day, reported, Mr. Davies, he says, I have secured evidence tending to show that upward of 15 boys were employed in the mine in violation of the child labor laws. Davies balked in inquiry. This is from the Inter-Ocean Chicago newspaper on 18th of November. Edgar T. Davies, state factory inspector, was balked by the St. Paul Coal Company just as he thought he had evidence to show that the 16 trapper boys who were thought to have been burned in the mine were illegally employed. Mr. Davies came here to claim the records at the company office. The payroll clerk told him the papers of John Bundy, the dead mine superintendent, would give the evidence he sought covering the boys' ages. The clerk went to the vault and took out the papers. Frank Buck, chief clerk, saw the move. He took the papers from his assistant, declaring they were the wrong ones. John Bundy has the papers you want, he said to Mr. Davies. Well, but Mr. Bundy is dead, Mr. Davies replied. Yes, I know he is, Buck answered, closing the vault and walking away. But he must have had them, for they're not here. Mr. Davies pleaded for a further search, but vainly. He may commence action to require the production of the papers and other records for use in his investigation. That boys underage are among the dead in the St. Paul mine has been proved to his own satisfaction, however, says Mr. Davies. Another thing that kind of irritated me was in the newspapers, initially women were not allowed into the tent where they were bringing up the remains because they said women were not strong enough to be able to identify their loved ones' remains. So the article that I just read concludes with a section called Mother Has Lost Reason. And I am reading this because Mrs. Howard, Alfred Howard and Sam Howard's mother, is the woman being quoted here. In one case, the child victim's mother has apparently lost her reason, and the state officials are investigating the case with a view to fixing the responsibility for violation of the law that has ended so doubly tragic in this particular case. It is the case of Mrs. Charles Howard, whose 15-year-old son Alfred is down in the dismal, death-filled depths of the mine. The case represents clearly a violation of the child labor law, said Mr. Davies today. We are on the track of many such cases. She's a woman who's lost her reason. Her 2 sons are dead in the mine. She would have been like any one of us out there screaming, where are my children? What's happening? She didn't lose her reason. And if I sound sarcastic, I am. Ultimately, depending on which newspaper source you're looking at, there were 10 to 11 alleged violations of the child labor law. The Times in Streeter, the Streeter Times, reported on December 8th that the St. Paul Mining Company claimed that, quote, possession of such a certificate shall exempt them from prosecution for the consequences of employing children under the age of 16. So in other words, if somebody lies, it's not my fault. We didn't do it. We should not be prosecuted. Attorney General W.H. Stead replied, it is nowhere prescribed that the possession of the certificates by the persons engaged in mining shall exempt them from the consequences of employing children under the prohibited age. So what happened as a result? The Champaign Daily News on June 21st, 1910 reported in the county circuit court in Princeton, the St. Paul Coal Company pled guilty of employing child labor in 10 cases. It was further reported in the Chicago Tribune the same day. The penalty of fines that was totaled was assessed $400 for the 4 trapper boys who died in the fire, $100 each. Additional fines amounting to $600 were assessed in the cases of 6 other underage trapper boys who escaped. Child labor laws, it is what it is, and you have to say sometimes, does the past and the present mirror one another? Right now, the child labor laws in 10 states, at least 10 states, are being challenged. And there are kids who are 14 years old working in meat packing plants. In Iowa, for one, kids are working in Arkansas, in Missouri. Bob, you need to get your wife on that case, please. So, what can I say? I would just urge you to read some of these books if you haven't. The richness that are the stories in Sherry Mine. Just kidding, go on. But I have to say too, there's just sometimes things happen that just tickle you to death. One of them was getting to meet Ray Tukai today, who built the model next door, and it was my friend from Missouri who brought him here, so thanks again, Bob. And the other was meeting Jessie Love's great-granddaughter and great-grandson. I wrote about their family in the book, partially because her great-grandmother, Jessie Love, was such a feisty woman. And to meet you today and to know that what she really was, that was just so absolutely awesome. So thank you for, inviting me down here today, Jack. Oh, yeah, right, if anybody has any questions, yeah. We can do that. I always forget to do that kind of stuff.
So
Yeah.
the laws were passed, but there was simply no enforcement. Is that the deal?
Well, isn't that the case?
Yeah.
Where you read so many companies? Yeah, was John Bundy, the mine superintendent, a good man? Yeah, he was. And did he knowingly turn a blind eye toward the age of those kids? Yeah, he did, because he knew their families, they had no choice. So, I mean, it makes you think. I mean, but given the size of Cherry, yeah, granted it's a lot smaller now, but people within communities knew one another. And the teachers knew, certainly, when they gave the certificates, they knew.
What was the population of Sherry?
By then it was 2,000, 2,500 maybe, about 2,500, so yeah, it's considerably smaller today. But I'll tell you, one of the interesting things in doing nonfiction is, and Karen had said this too, you've gotta go and walk in the shoes pretty much of what you've done. And coming here to say that, for example, Antonori Quartaroli, took 7 minutes to walk up to the mine shaft. Well, how did I know he could do it? Because I did it from where his house was. And you really do have a sense then of, what it's like.
Brother Jones was for child labor in mine workers in Pennsylvania. Is there any connection with her and Sherry?
The name that came up frequently for me when I was looking through the stuff was Jane Addams. And of course she was in Chicago with Hull House, and also Florence Kelly. And I'm not familiar particularly with her, but Jane Addams' name, I did not run across Mother Jones anywhere though. Yeah, way back. I didn't run into any, he asked if they sent small kids in because they could get into the small spaces. I did not run into anything like that here. The kids that were working in the mines were working to move stuff, and that it wasn't that they were squeezing into little tiny places. Yeah.
When did that mine close?
So 1935-ish?
I think in the late 20s, I think.
Because it ran out of
What happened was the
Wait
company
a minute.
sold it.
I was at a conference one time, and somebody asked a nonfiction author a question about, well, when did the whatever so-and-so happen?
And he goes, I don't know. He said, I wrote it in my book, and if you want to know that, go look it up in my book. So I don't remember, but I wrote it in my book, and I'll look it up right now. the company, it reopened in late 1910, and it closed the mine permanently on April 30th, 1927, but a local man, John Bartoli, did you know? John
Bartoli's are around here.
Yeah.
There's-
They reopened the mine in 1929, and they ceased operation in 1934, and the mine completely closed in 1935.
You said because it ran out, happened.
I always, the quote was always made that you could more economically get coal in southern Illinois.
Yeah,
Yeah.
finances.
Right.
So, now I've got one other story that I have to share, because it has nothing to do with child labor law. The piles out there, which you can see from a long distance away. Deanne Posey is kind of in charge of the mine museum next door, and while I was doing some of my research, I came down here and she said, oh, you want to talk to my husband, Jim. My husband's name is Jim, so I'm always happy to talk to a Jim. And I said, okay, and so he took me out there, and he was gonna show me where the mine opening shaft actually was, but there was barbed wire on top of the fence, and we decided it probably was not a good idea to climb over it, which was what I thought I would do. But he was telling me that when the slag heaps were still unforested, so when he was a kid, because Jim was raised here, that Peter Dona, who you've heard mentioned several times today, ran a junkyard, and he would let Jim and his friends come and build go-karts. And they would take their go-karts to the top of the slag heaps and ride down them. And he said our parents didn't know about it, but he said that's what we used to do when we were kids. And I thought, wow, that's a pretty cool story. So anyway, whatever.
Thanks, Sally. Thank you, Sally.